Let's talk about how to handle a tantrum when your child does not want to get into the car seat. So, my name's Jodie Thornton, and today we're going to talk about the step by step to make this as easy as possible on your child. Ultimately, we want to get to a place where they don't need to tantrum in this situation. But in the meantime, between now and when we get there, we're going to follow the same steps to handle it, even if they do get upset. So the first thing I want to say is that if you're going through a stage where you know your child is going to be upset by needing to leave where you're coming from, so whether that's because you know that they just don't want to get in the car, or whether you know it's a place where they're not going to want to leave, I want you to not try and wait as long as you can. So there's a lot of temptation for us parents to, because we know our child doesn't want to leave, we're going to leave at the last possible moment so they get as much as they can of what they don't want to leave, and then we get going. And the basic premise behind that is that if they get as much as they can of what they want, then they will be happier to acquiesce and go with what we want, right? Now, the only reason we think that is because in our culture, there's this unwritten rule that if you've had enough of what you want, then it's you have to accept that now it's somebody else's turn, right? And our culture doesn't focus on the idea of how do we find a solution that works for everybody. Our culture is you've had a lot of what you want, that is enough, and it is time to move on, right? Because we have internalized that, we now have this basic assumption that when we get a lot of what we want and then someone else says, okay, it's time to go, we will acquiesce. We will tell ourselves that it's okay that we don't get what we want. Our children have not learned that yet. And we can teach them that, or we can teach them how to problem solve, and that it's okay for them to want their needs to be met all the time, but just they also know how to handle it when they don't get their needs met, right? So the basic premise of that first point is that we don't want to extend ourselves as far as we possibly can on the basis that that will make it easier, because that won't work with most kids, right? And we don't want the process of helping our children learn that is actually kind of counterproductive to them learning about emotional awareness and being considerate but also assertive. So rather than do that, we're going to focus on the problem solving part of things. So for that first part, we want to allow yourself time if you can. Now, sometimes we can't. Sometimes, the one activity leads to the next and we have to go in a hurry. But if you have the opportunity, make sure you give yourself some time before you actually have to be leaving in order to go through these steps. The more time you've got, the easier it will be. And so if you can have the time, that's great, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is, when you first talk to your child about we need to go now, we want that step to be just a discussion, not a let's go, right? So what I mean about that in practice is we don't say, okay, come on, let's go, right? Instead, we want to have a conversation about the fact that we're going to go and then go. So that starts off with us saying, oh, it's time to leave now, we've got to go home, right? So we're just explaining what's going to happen. Now, I always say let's just give that information on the off chance that they just say, okay, let's go, right? It's rare, but it does happen. And the more you follow these steps, the more often it will happen. But we just want to give that opportunity for us to express this is what's needed at this moment. So let's do it, right? So you're just giving them, we're not trying to over-explain, we're not trying to make them sound like they want to, right? We're not saying it's exciting to do something that we know they're not going to want to do. We're just explaining it's time to go now because we need to go for a nap, or it's time to go now because it's nearly dinner, or whatever the real reason is that you need to leave. Just going to express that clearly to them. Now, assuming that they do not want to go and they express that to you, then your next step is not to explain again or to explain more or to make a better case for them to want to come home. The next step is actually to understand why they don't want to. Right, so as you've asked, they've expressed they don't want to, go back to them, right? You're going to go back and understand why they don't want to. So if you already know, you can say, oh, sweetie, I know you'd like to stay at the park for hours because it's so much fun, right? If you already know the reason, just express that you get it. Don't go straight into, I know you want to stay at the park, but, right? Don't move away. We're just empathizing with what they need, right? And so if you don't already know what the reason is, right? And I'm not talking about I don't want to go. I'm talking about why don't they want to go? Do they not want to go because they're in the middle of playing? Do they not want to go because they've just met a new friend? Do they not want to go because they don't like being strapped into the car seat? Like, why don't they want to go? And we want to really empathize with that. So if you don't know what the issue is, you need to ask, right? So just tell me about it. You don't want to go? Tell me about that, right? Or how come? Or any kind of question. And it's okay, like the tone of voice doesn't have to be like soft and warm and loving. It can be cheeky, it can be curious, it can also even be frustrated, so long as the tone doesn't imply that they shouldn't have a problem. Right? So long as the tone is, I'm interested to find out what your concern is, then it's okay for that tone to sound frustrated. So you'd be like, well, we really need to go. Why is it that you don't want to go? So you can see in that tone, like it's clear that I'm not really enjoying myself, but it's also clear that I do want to know the answer. I'm not telling them that they should not have a problem. I'm telling them that I want to understand what's going on from their perspective. So once you've got that information, and I would say sometimes kids, sometimes people will say, well, my child wouldn't tell me. Ask, right? Because it is surprising how young a child can actually let us know what they need when they're asked to do it. Sometimes they haven't thought about what the issue is, and asking encourages them to think about it. Sometimes they don't know how to articulate it, but again, asking invites them to practice, right? And so we can get there. And even if they cannot, if they're actually incapable because they don't know or they don't know how to say it, by you asking them the question, it helps your brain shift into curiosity and understanding and think about what clues do I have? How could I figure this out? Like, what is the reason they don't want to go? So that will really help you. So once we've gotten to that place, you empathize with, I understand you really don't want to go because you're in the middle of playing and you'd like to finish building, this stick house. I'm making things up, obviously, and struggling. You really want to finish making a stick house and you don't want to go, right? So then in that example, we're looking for what is the reason they want to finish building a stick house. Is it because it's fun? Is it because they really like to complete things? They really like to get that feeling of accomplishment? Is it that they want to finish building the stick house because they've got a friend that they're doing it with? We're looking for what is that underlying issue. Now we're looking for what is a way that you can get that underlying need met while also going home now. And often we can't, especially at these like junctures of having to leave one place, going to the next place. And especially if you're going in the car or the pram, like you're limited in the options for a lot of things, like for physicality because they're strapped in, for fun, like you can get them to have fun in the car or the pram, but obviously it limits the options. Even for connection, you can do it in the car and the pram, but it is trickier than when you're not in a transport mode. But if we can find a way to get both of your need to leave and their need, whatever that is, to be met at the same time, that's what we're aiming for, right? Now, in the event that we can't, we're going to express that their needs are valid, that their needs matter, and that you would do it if you could. So let's say the stick house, we go back to the stick house example, they're building a stick house, and the reason they want to finish it is that they like the sense of accomplishment. There's not really a way that you can get them that sense of accomplishment around the stick house by going home, right? It's really tricky. You could try saying like, maybe I'll take a photo with my phone and we can build it again the next time we come. It's going to be tricky for a small child to like have that delayed gratification, and that it just might not hold. There's really not many options. Like, you might be able to think of one, but right in this moment, I'm not thinking of any that are like kind of obvious there. And so then we're really empathizing with, I'm so sorry that you're not going to get to finish, because I know you really like to finish when you try to build a structure. I know that it's really important to you, and I'm so sorry you're not going to get to finish it today. We need to go because it's nap time. Right? And even then, it's nap time, I might give a little bit more information. We need to go because if you don't get your nap, it's going to be a really tricky afternoon and you will feel really sad and frustrated. Now, you can see how if I'm the 2-year-old on the receiving end of this, I'm like, well, I'm sad and frustrated if I have to leave the park, right? And so our job is not to convince them, and our job is not to expect them to understand like consequences and, you know, what's going to happen 3 hours from now. Our job is not to make them want to leave, right? We're not trying to convince them. What we're doing is expressing your needs are valid, your needs are important. I would do it if I could, and here's the reason why I can't. That's all we're doing. We're just expressing what can and can't happen. Now, as your child gets to know this new way of you explaining things, they will be able to sense the difference between you saying, oh, I just don't really want to stay at the park, versus we need to go because it's nap time, and if you don't get your nap, it's going to be a really tricky afternoon, right? And so you can hear the certainty in my voice when I'm saying that. They start to get to understand where is a boundary that is malleable and can be negotiated versus where is a boundary that it just is what it is and we're going to need to go. And then you'll find that rather than fighting the boundaries that they can't, they might express that they're frustrated, but they're not going to do the same level of like tantruming to get what they want. They're not going to do the same level of pestering and nagging over time. That will diminish because part of it is understanding the difference between which boundaries are malleable and negotiable and which boundaries aren't. But also they get a real sense that you understand what's important to them, you care about what's important to them, and you really are looking for a way for them to get their needs met. And that makes a huge difference in their willingness to go along with something that's less than ideal from their perspective. So that all being the case, sometimes you will get to that place, and the more often you do this, the more often that will happen. You'll get to a place where they might be unhappy, but they won't necessarily tantrum before they get in the car. You may still find that they're still resistant, and that may still be in a tantrum. And in that case, if you've got the time to sit and hold space for those feelings, then you can do that. Now, obviously, in the example I'm using, we're running up against nap time. I wouldn't hold space for feelings in a way that means that nap is late, because then you're just getting more and more tired, so it just makes it harder and harder, right? But let's say you need to go home because it's time to make the dinner, and you've allowed enough time that it's okay for you to stay at the park for a little bit longer, not for playing, but for holding space for the feelings of frustration. Then hold space for as long as you have the time and you have the patience, right? And then that way, if you can hold space until they calm down, then they can be much more willing to come into the car. If you can't hold space because you've run out of time or you've run out of patience, then all you're going to do is, with the minimum of force and the minimum of fuss, we're just going to take them and pop them in the car. And I know sometimes it's extremely difficult when they do the ironing board pose and, you know, they're tantruming on the way. We're just going to do as best we can to just scoop them up and get them into the car and take them home. As I say, this is not about one specific tantrum being handled in a specific way. It's like if you get all the stars aligned, everything will be perfect. What we're more looking for is this process of, I'm communicating to you that what's needed. If you're not happy with that, I want to understand your perspective. I'm looking for a solution that works for both of us. And if we can't find one and I have to stick to what's important to me, I'm going to be really respectful and understanding in the process that that's hard for you. And we're going, and ultimately, if we have to go, we're going to go. Right? So that the more we do that process, the more often you'll find the process is easier for you to implement, but also the more often you'll find that your child is more understanding. They feel heard, they feel understood, they feel respected. They know that if we can find a solution that works for both of us, we absolutely will. Right? That the more they have that trust in the process, the less often you'll have them tantruming, the less intense the tantrums will be, and the less duration they'll last, right? The shorter amount of time you'll have to hold space for the feelings, or the shorter amount of time they'll be tantruming in the car as you're driving home, right? So that's the process I would use. Now, if there are a couple of places there that holding space for their feelings was quite important. So in the beginning, when we're trying to understand their perspective, if you don't already know what their perspective is, or if you understand their perspective but they're overwhelmed and not listening to the fact that you understand it, and also at the end piece where if we can't find a solution and they're overwhelmed, we want to hold space for those feelings. If that's something that you need some improvement on your skill level around, come along to my webinar on Supporting Kids Through Tantrums. In that webinar, we're going to focus on what to do with your body language, your tone of voice, and the word choice you use to help your child regulate, to come down out of the overwhelm into the rational space, so that you can talk through, so that they can express to you what's going on, so that they can hear you validate it, so that you can hold space for those feelings. You can find that webinar at jodiethornton.com/tantrums, which will make that whole process a lot easier if that's not already something that comes easily for you. That webinar will make this whole process a lot easier for you. Now, if you have any questions at all, it's Jodie at jodiethornton.com to send through any emails. I would love to hear any questions you have about today's video, or any questions you have about parenting, because I'm always looking to create more videos and tips and help for parents. Thanks so much for watching.